Thanks for the invite to come and have a chat to the group this afternoon. I think last time we spoke with this group was 12 months ago, and I flagged that we'd done a lot of work in the election space over that 2016 election, and there was a lot of work to come. And that's been ongoing, and we're sort of getting to the back end of that now, but it's worth reflecting on. And back then I sort of gave an indication that we're going to follow up a lot of the issues, and we have. It's been pretty significant for us. We've been quite busy in terms of some of the broader investigations. We've looked at about 290 failures to declare campaign donations within the framework, and of that we issued about 150 odd warnings to people. But more importantly, we've got 15 prosecutions underway for people that have not met their responsibilities, and that's really important because that underpins that level of transparency in local government elections. So that's one part of the work. The next important part we did was follow up with about 31 candidates around what they disclosed and the probity of those disclosures as well. So that was a really interesting piece of work. It was the first time that we'd ventured down that path, and it revealed some pretty interesting things around size of campaign disclosures and the type of income that comes in and how it's expended. Generally, there was a good level of compliance with candidates in terms of what they were disclosing and the probity of those disclosures. But it did reveal a couple of really interesting things for us, which we're following up now. So we've got 2 candidates that are the subject of a pretty serious investigation for what they haven't declared and where that money came from. In the last 12 months, we've wrapped up a pretty significant investigation at Wyndham. It's a really, I heard the commentary before about it being such a growth area. It's a really interesting area. There's a lot of dynamics there. We had a broader investigation into the elections on the basis there was about 91 candidates for the positions there, and it was at a ratio, it was way out of kilter with the rest of the state. So it had some interesting dynamics going on, and we're just preparing a brief for our lawyers out of that one, so there'll be a bit more to come out of that. More importantly, a lot of the work we did formed the basis of submissions to LGV about some reforms that we're seeking and still trying to seek to tighten up that electoral process. And as I said, for us, that really does underpin the 4-year term of council, is the integrity of that front end of the system to make sure that the right people are nominating and the right people go through the electoral process and are elected to office. Right now, we've got 19 prosecution cases underway. A lot of those are those campaign donation ones, but we've got 4 or 5 other pretty serious ones that are in various stages at the moment. So we've got a fair bit on. But I guess the most important thing for you guys is what are we going to do over the next 12 months and what the landscape looks like. Let's see if we can get this to work. Okay. Here we go. So in the last 12 months ago, I did a bit of a roadshow around the state and met many of you in this room, and that was one of the fun parts of the job. It was terrific, and I use this slide a lot, so you've seen it before, you've seen this picture. When I talk about what we're going to do in the future, it was really important for us to reflect on some of the work we've done, and in particular this one, which was a conflict of interest matter at Central Goldfields Shire Council, where a council was ultimately prosecuted and was proven to breach the conflict of interest provisions. As I said, it was really important for us to, when we looked at our next phase of work, to explore where we should put our resources and where was the best place to put our very limited resources. One of the things that struck us was we thought that conflict of interest might be a bit of a problem in regional areas as opposed to metro, so it was important to verify that and then see some of the reasons why. And as I say, our whole objective is improving transparency, integrity and accountability across local government, so therefore if we can improve and minimise those sort of offences, then hopefully we will be improving the system. Okay, so the first thing we did was go back and look at our data to see what that might have pointed to. It was pretty interesting. When we looked at about 2,000 complaints over the last 3.5 years, we started to see some trends, and I'll run through them in a second. What we did, our system's got limitations on it in terms of how deep we can go, but we ultimately drilled down to individual complaints to get some of the themes that I'll talk about in a minute. What we did was categorise the complaints in terms of the things that are in our jurisdiction for a start, things that we will look at, and we broke them into the 4 categories of the conflict of interest, which is in the blue, the conduct and behaviour issues, which is in red, the misuse of position, which is in green, and the confidential information, which is in the purple colour. What it tells us is that there's a bit of a difference between metro and regional councils, and roughly the same amount of complaints, so there's about 1,000 each over the period. That was interesting in itself. That was a pretty even split. And I guess one of the other really interesting points is that you can see on the chart far more issues in metro councils are reported around conduct and really serious misconduct matters that might fall into our jurisdiction. But more interesting, it sort of validated the thought we had that the conflict of interest was more prevalent in rural areas. And when we looked at the individual complaints, when we drilled down, there was a couple of themes that emerged as to why this was most likely the case. One of the first things that jumped out of us was the profile of councillors and the administration in a local community. Councillors and council administration have a much greater profile than they do in metro areas. And by virtue of that profile, the interests of the people involved in the decision making, albeit councillors and sometimes administration providing advice, those interests are more visible, particularly interested around property or business or even roles outside of council. So they're the two key things that struck us. And then, of course, we found a lot of the complaints that we receive are misguided in that there's not an awareness of the conflict of interest framework that exists in the legislation. And that's a really important distinction about what we do and what Alistair was talking about before. We're one of the rare sectors that in the public sector where there is a legislative framework for a conflict of interest. There is actually a defined law around it. So in dealing with that, a lot of people aren't quite sure what those laws are, and particularly the exemptions, which are the really important part, which allow council and council staff to be part of the decision-making process. And a really common example is that a councillor might be a member of a local club. So there's a perception that if anything comes before council about that club, there's instantly a conflict of interest. Well, the law says there's not. There's an exemption. Unless you hold an office in that other body, you can be a member and you can still participate in the process. So that's that means we get an awful lot of complaints from people that don't understand that legislative framework. And we consider those ones more the perceived conflicts of interest. And where we find a conflict of interest is actually substantiated. It's generally due to three key drivers, and that's around a genuine unawareness of the law, which is no excuse, of course, but that's one of the reasons. There's also a driver that's a willful blindness, where people don't want to know the law and avoid learning about it for obvious reasons. And then, of course, you've got self-interest. So you've got genuine disregard for the law, most likely for own self-interest, as I said. Okay. There we go. All right. So let's look at those drivers. Okay, the first category, genuine unawareness. As I said, it's no excuse, but it's pretty clear that in many instances across the sector there is an unawareness or a lack of knowledge about the laws. I think what we need to do and what we really need to drive, and this is part of this process, is to really try and drive that education side of the process around inductions, training, using our case studies to inform and really developing an understanding of a real legislative conflict of interest versus a perceived, and then how that's treated. There is a challenge, of course. There is many people out there that don't want to learn and don't want to participate in the training process, and that's a challenge that we all face. The second category probably drifts into a little bit, that willful blindness, where people don't want to see a conflict of interest and don't want to learn about them. Pretty important that a really strong culture of an organisation can address that, having obviously processes and a commitment to call out conflict of interest and be safe in doing so. That can really help the business perform at a transparent level. Again, as I said, that identification of a real conflict of interest, which is against the law, is really important because that comes with consequences. But also identifying the perceived ones and having a process to identify them so that other members of perhaps the community can see that it's been addressed, spoken about and dealt with. So that's really important as well. The third category, self-interest, disregard for the law. That's something that always is going to exist, and that's unfortunate, but that's, I guess, one of the reasons that my role exists. We find that those that are involved in decision-making for their own self-interest generally do take the opportunity to learn and seek guidance, and generally do participate in induction and training and look at case studies, and that's for obvious reasons to perhaps help them guide their way through the process. I think obviously to mitigate that, there's a combination of factors, and it really is about having an element of each category, making sure there's proper training and induction, making sure that there's really solid governance around the culture of the organisation and the processes to deal with conflicts of interest, and making sure that there's integrity agencies there to pick up the pieces when one gets through. If we go back to Central Goldfields, I think all three elements sort of came to the fore. There was a lack of understanding of the legislation. There's no doubt there was willful blindness on many people's part that could allow a $3.2 million driveway to be built for a councillor. And of course there was an element of self-interest as well. But the overarching driver, I think, was that willful blindness. Okay, all right. So, in consideration of all that data, what's next? What are we planning for the next 12 months? This is probably the really important thing for you guys. It's all about, for us, improving and putting some effort back into the proactive side of the business. We spent a lot of time cleaning up the elections. Now it's moving back into the proactive side. The first area for us is to recommence our field audit program. So many of you that have been in local government for some time will recall we formally came out to councils and looked at a whole range of topics and provided advice back to councils. We're going to reconstitute that. This time around it's going to be much more targeted, and we're going to use the learnings primarily from Central Goldfields around the risk issues that occurred there and drill down into those risk issues. So we'll be looking at asset management, particularly around the sale of public assets. We'll be looking at grant management and expense claims. We'll be looking at HR processes as an indicator of the culture of the organisation, and then the really strong governance issues around interest returns, public records, policies, delegations for risk issues, and we'll certainly have a look at the Audit Committee Charter and how the audit committees are performing for your councils. And as I said, our objective is to identify these issues early, or if they have been tracking for a while, identify them and work with councils to improve them. And again, I think Alistair used the term, it's not a gotcha moment unless we find another Central Goldfields. This is all about working with councils to improve the landscape. And secondly, we're going to really focus again on our guidance and education, which is important for the right now because we've got a whole range of work to do here, as I just outlined. But it's also really important for the future, and particularly with the legislative reforms that are proposed, and particularly those reforms around conflict of interest. And I'm not sure if you've read it, but they're quite significant reforms from the current legislative framework to what's proposed in the legislation. So I guess importantly, I think for us, as I said, this is about improving the reputation of councils and the ability to do business. And I note some of the themes of this forum is about advocacy in an election year. I see it as absolutely vital that councils have a good reputation to be able to perform that advocacy well. Obviously, if there are issues, it's going to make it very difficult to get that foot in the door. So, as I said, our role is to try and assist, help, raise, elevate that reputation to allow you guys the best opportunity for getting your rail line. Okay, that's it from me. I'm open for questions.
Thank you, David. Questions? Yes.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, righto. Thanks, David. Adrian Weston, Campaspe. You'll see last month you spent a bit of time at the Vic catchments and water inductions from across the state. Third one that I've participated in. Do you see something like that being useful for local government at a mandatory level in future to help get that capacity for councillors?
Yeah, so Adrian's talking about a forum that was run by DELP last month where the water boards were all brought together for a forum for the day, and there was a range of topics discussed. Particularly, I was there for conflict of interest because of the crossover and similarities to the issues that councils face as water boards face, and there's a lot of councillors that are on water boards. One of the difficulties is with this tier of government is mandating anything, and I must say I'm not a great fan of mandating. I think every time you regulate something or say something has to happen, it comes at a cost. But I think the concept of a statewide councillor forum that is run by the department or the government is a very good concept, really good concept. There was a lot of great learnings from that day, and it was really interesting, and I found it terrific to be part of another sector but talking about this sector. And what struck me is in many cases we do it really, really well. And I talk about we as local government, but it struck me that we do it quite well.